Right, this is perception and perspective part two, in a sense, because as we sometimes do, there's just too much here to fold into one 20-minute piece. So we're going to break it into two of around about 11 minutes or so. So, Rebecca, you finished part one explaining the NLP, what I think of as second positioning, genuinely empathizing, behaviorally, not just saying the words.
Yeah.
Where should we go next with this? Because there's a lot more to be said around the value and the use of understanding different perspectives and perceptions. Where do you want to take us next?
I think that's it. I think, how do we, well, what are the benefits, I suppose? What are the benefits
Go for it.
of that? First of all, is that it can help in so many different ways. It helps to reduce conflict, it helps to reduce misunderstandings, it can help in lots of different industries. You know, it's useful for sales, it's useful for change management. The benefits of having a better understanding of someone else's point of view helps in on so many levels and in and so many people as well. I think that it's just too big to just ignore, you know, for me.
It is, but it has been, and it continues to be. The trouble is, we sit here and talk about the world as it should be, and then we have to remind ourselves, hang on a minute, this doesn't actually happen. That's not to say it couldn't and it shouldn't, and that we can't ourselves be a bit of an influence in making it happen more often than it does. So we're not just talking theoretically here, we are talking with the aspiration, the ambition of actually seeing a bit more of this happening. There's two things I'm going to throw in at this point. I'll throw them in now because it might or might not be something we return to. Perception is reality. One of Peter Honey's 6 principles of behavior. I use it a lot. Perception is reality. If I think that wall behind me is green, it's green. I don't care if you think it's red. I don't care if you think those are bricks and not stones. If I think they're one thing and not another, that's my reality. Perception is reality. And you've just thrown up something else there about challenge, if you like, challenging yourself to have the will to try and understand someone else's perspective, but also challenging others on theirs, because we don't always accept someone else's perspective. You might challenge it and say, well, actually, no, I've heard what you think. I think you're wrong. So this isn't all cozy stuff. And I'm going to throw in the word contrarian. I've written a blog on this ages ago about the value of contrarians, people that actually challenge and say, that's not how I see it. So I'll just throw those into the mix and see if that takes you anywhere at all. You can dismiss it if you like.
Again, there's a lot of things there, isn't it? And I think it can just help to broaden horizons, if nothing else. So the contrary thing. If you're only ever talking with people who have the same viewpoint as you have a very limited view of the world.
Yeah.
Might be uncomfortable and it might be challenging to have conversations with different points of view, but it helps to give you a fuller picture. You know, because as we discussed before, if I'm looking at one thing from one side and you're looking at it from the other side, we're going to have two different viewpoints, but neither of us are wrong. So having a better understanding, or just being aware that there could be a different view, being aware that there could be a different viewpoint, I think is valuable in the first instance.
All right. And my oh yes, but voice sitting on this shoulder says, yeah, right, great idea. When have we seen this happen? I absolutely agree with you. I've been out there in print saying that there's huge value in saying, don't just surround yourself by people who think you're right. Listen to some people who actually think you're wrong, because they might reinforce your view you're right, because they might say, okay, I've listened to what you had to say, Rebecca. I know you're completely opposed to this. You've made me think about what I'm doing, and I haven't changed a bit, because even though you've seen things different than me, what's that helped me do is to be more reinforced that I was right all along. So sometimes a contrarian can actually be useful to reinforce a position that they don't hold, but you do, but you revisited, reflected upon, and genuinely believe to be right. You don't have to listen to contrarians and say, oh yeah, good idea, your idea is better than mine every time, although it might be. And that's where the bigger challenge comes, to say, whoa, hold on a minute, am I big enough to say, okay, you're right and I'm wrong, how can I phrase this without looking like a complete climb down?
Yeah, it's not easy. I mean, a lot of the things we talk about are uncomfortable, but I think this is often where more learning comes from, is a willingness to admit that perhaps you're wrong or that there's something different. It's not necessarily being right and wrong. It's just an awareness that my way is not necessarily the best or only way of doing things.
Yeah, this is a big shift for a lot of people,
Yeah.
because I'm also thinking that ego and status
Mm.
that comes with moving up the hierarchy of an organization means you more often than you used to be feel the need irrationally to be right more often than you previously did.
But wouldn't it be interesting, or wouldn't you be willing to give more respect to a leader who is willing to accept that perhaps they were wrong, or perhaps that there is a different way of looking at things, rather than just blindly going just because that's the way they've said it's going to be, that's the way it is?
Oh, totally. I have huge respect for people who basically are saying, wow, this is painful, I don't entirely like this, but I think there's something in here I need to think about. I just don't hear it very often. And I don't think it's entirely the fault of the individual. Very often it's the environment in which they are, which requires them to think that way and to protect a position, sometimes irrationally, because to expose yourself to the repercussions of being seen to be imperfect has potentially a lot of bad news coming your way.
Yeah, and maybe that's the culture though, because for me, if I see that somebody is human, I actually think that's a positive.
Me too.
You know, that they're actually a human being. They do make mistakes. They're not infallible.
But I'm not after their
They're
job.
they're willing to put the hand up and say, okay, yeah, I made a mistake, or maybe I didn't do things as best I could have done. I will learn from that.
I'm not surrounded by people who want your job, who would say, hey, look, Andrew says he's done something wrong, but I can use that. The world which we want doesn't exist often enough, but it can and it should. I think should. I mean, there's me saying my perception is this. I don't know. The more time I spend out of organizations, and I've worked outside of them and with them for 32 years, the more I don't really understand many of them. Because why can't they do this stuff? Why can't people be big enough? Why do the only two leaders that have ever impressed me have something in common that is exactly this? That will actually look at you in the eye and say, just because I'm paid the most in this organization doesn't mean I'm right all the time. What do you think? Whoa, we've heard that twice in 42 years.
But doesn't that make them an interesting and exceptional leader?
Precisely for that reason. And there's only two of them. 42 years I've been in this business. Wouldn't you be impressed by two people in leadership roles?
Admitting you're wrong. I mean, I always go back to I had an interview many years ago and I was given a spreadsheet to do something with. Basically, I had to put it into a usable format and take it into the formal interview. I managed to delete the spreadsheet first of all, so I had to ask for another copy of it because I'd managed to delete it. And I thought, I've got no idea what I'm doing with this. And I thought, well, I'm gonna have to. So I had to admit, I had to walk into the interview and say, I'm sorry, I haven't done anything with this spreadsheet because I didn't know what to do with it. I mean, luckily, I had been given a few questions in advance to prepare for. But I walked out of that interview.
Right, but I know you wouldn't have raised that issue unless you thought there's something in here to pick up on. What do you think that interview panel person, whatever, perceived, their perception of you that said, hey, this person's just done that wrong. My perception of her is sufficiently positive to offer the job. What did they perceive? This is you building yourself up now. So take all the time you need on this.
Hopefully, recognizing that I'm honest, that I wasn't going to be willing to. There was a willingness to admit that I'd made a mistake. First of all, that I was honest about things, and that vulnerability, I suppose, in some respects. And
the perception of you was helped to be an accurate perception by your behaviour. Now, I just edited out the 19 minutes of Rebecca saying how wonderful else she was in that interview, so we're back live again now. So what you're highlighting is that sometimes perceptions are built on one experience, and we don't have to be informed, do we, to hold a strong perception. I've got perceptions about people that are probably totally unreasonable in the view of many others, about people I've never met, never will, but I still think of certain things because I'm told this by the media or whatever. So we don't need to be well informed or accurate or even reasonable to hold a perception. It's still strong.
It is, and again, maybe that's another good point, is when we meet somebody and we already have a perception of them, is it worth just holding in that thought that maybe this is not the right view that I have of them, or not the full view. It's not necessarily that it's not right, but maybe it's not the full picture. And sometimes that's worth.
Do we have a strong enough interest in the people, for instance, with whom we work, to even engage in that? Do we ever sit down and say, I mean, there's people I've worked with in the past that I haven't particularly liked. And if I ever reflected on why that might be, a lot of that might have been down to me, but I probably wasn't prepared to have that conversation with myself.
Yeah. And sometimes it's beneficial, and sometimes maybe the consequences aren't, rewarding enough, or maybe the incentive isn't there to be willing to have those conversations. I think it depends on context, but I think it could improve a lot of situations if everybody was a little bit more willing to recognize that their viewpoint is one viewpoint, not necessarily the full picture.
Okay, I'm going to push us towards a conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
Key points emerging so far, because I go away and think about this myself. I guess for me, it's about exploring and clarifying other positions of people beyond your assumptions to get more accuracy and more data to base your opinions. So interactively exploring, being interested enough to ask questions rather than just throwing opinions. I guess that's where I'm thinking. Hasn't there been times? Yes, there have. Will there be times in the future when it's relevant to say, I'd like to know more about why you think the way you do about this? I suppose that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. And I think that's all I would like to encourage people, is to be willing and recognize that there are many different viewpoints. None of them are necessarily wrong, none of them are necessarily better than others, but there are different viewpoints. And the more you can understand that, and the more you can see different viewpoints, the more fuller the picture will be.
And the better the decisions, for instance, and outcomes and solutions that could result.
Yes.
Because we are talking about tangible outcomes here, not just people being nice to each other.
No.
Okay, that's been thought-provoking. Thank you as ever.
Thank you.